Right. I believe we're live. Perfect. Um, Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining us on this discussion today. I am Wole Talabi, engineer, writer, editor, mostly in that order. I am the author of Shigidi and the Brass Head of Obalufon and the recent short story collection, Convergence Problems. And I am here with two authors to talk about their two new books. Stewart Baker, author of The Butterfly Disjunct and Other Stories, and Cheryl Ntumy, author of Songs for the Shadows. And I'll let them quickly introduce themselves before we begin our discussion. Stuart, do you want to go first?
Sure. Speaking of awkward silences. Hello, everybody. My name is Stewart Baker. I am a librarian, but also a short story writer, poet, game writer, editor, probably a couple of other things. Um, yeah, that's my introduction. Obviously well rehearsed. Cheryl?
I hope you can hear me well. Um, I am Cheryl S. Ntumy, and I am the author of Songs for the Shadows. I am a freelance writer, editor, and yeah, basically any literary type work. I am based in Ghana, um, and I'm also part of the Sativas Collective, and I'll be speaking more on that a bit later on. And yeah, it's great to see everybody, and thank you very much for being here.
Awesome. Um, so yes, thankfully Cheryl mentioned she's in Ghana because we're basically spanning the entire globe, right? I am currently based in Australia. Cheryl is in Ghana and Stuart is in
I am in Oregon, so West Coast, United States.
excellent. So basically, from one side of the planet to the other. And we're going to be talking about a very lofty topic, or three lofty topics: mystery, meaning, and mortality, which sounds like an excellent title for a conference paper, for like a philosophy conference. But we are not going to be discussing the academics of mystery, meaning, and mortality or philosophy in any way. We're going to be instead talking about how these themes appear in Stewart and Cheryl's work, both of which I have read and both of which are excellent. So if you haven't picked up each of those books, I strongly recommend that you do. Songs for the Shadows is a novella, so very immersive, very lush, very beautiful, very easy to read. Jump in, immerse yourself in the world, and by the time you jump out, something meaningful would have happened to you. Let's put it that way. It's a very moving book. And the Butterfly Disjunct and Other Stories is basically a tasting menu of some very fascinating, wonderful narrative pieces, very playful, very thoughtful. In some ways you could say, inspired by philosophy conferences. There is quite literally a story in the book that is about a time travel academic conference that goes not horribly wrong, but goes wrong in an interesting and fascinating way. But it's the kind of book that you pick up, you dive in and out of, enjoying each story one by one. And both books are definitely worth your time. And we're going to be talking about both of them today using these three ideas as themes, right? And of course, because I've read both books, I have lots of questions that I'm going to be asking, and I'm going to be acting as the audience proxy. Okay. So I'll try not to give away any spoilers, but just to get both authors' thoughts on the topics. All right. Okay. So let us begin with a question, which is one of my favorite questions about time. Time is one of those mysterious things that we all experience, we all are very much aware of. And if you ask anybody what time is, they have a very clear sense of what it is. But fundamentally, we don't actually know what time is. In a physics sense, in a metaphysical sense, in an experiential sense, no one can actually cleanly define what time is without resorting back to circular definitions. Um, One of my favorite anecdotes is that in classical physics, almost every equation involving time can be replaced with a negative sign and work perfectly fine, which means that the universe is what physicists call T-symmetric. Time can move forwards and backwards equally, probably, but it just doesn't. It just always goes in one direction, and very few people can explain why. It gets more complicated, obviously, but time is a mystery, let's just say. And because of that, it's a very curious thing to dig into, to think about, to talk about. And in both the Butterfly Disjunct and in Songs for the Shadows, as I implied earlier about the temporal conference story, both Stewart and Cheryl, both of you, use elements of broken time, twisted time, or being outside of time to explore the different ways that time affects the human experience, in reference to things like love, memory, grief, and so on. So I just wanted both of you, if possible, to talk a little bit about why you're attracted to the idea of time conceptually. And if possible, what exactly about the mystery of time did you find most intriguing while writing your stories? And Cheryl, do you want to go first?
Um, that the thing that was the most interesting to me was, I mean, like you say, the fact that time isn't something that we can necessarily define. And I wanted to explore that specifically in the context of someone being forced to face difficult things and not being able to escape. So I really wanted to kind of look at what would it be like to be in a position where you do not have the luxury of saying, oh, I'll deal with it tomorrow. You know, you don't have the luxury of finding all the usual escapes, and you're just kind of stuck and you have to deal with it right now because there is no other. Yeah, so I wanted to explore sort of the eternal present moment, kind of the spiritual concept of it, I guess, of what it means to be in the now, and how that could affect someone who is dealing with a trauma, and how that would, yeah, what would happen in that kind of situation.
Just to give a bit of context, as you're giving an answer to the question, could you just give like a 1 or 2 line summary of like the blurb for Songs for the Shadows, just so people that haven't read it know a general idea of what it's about?
Right, yeah. Okay, so Songs for the Shadows is a story about a woman who goes through a really traumatic experience in her youth, and then essentially spends the rest of her life trying to find ways to escape from the grief and the pain of that situation. Um, and she ends up in a very high risk career as a sound excavator, which is just as weird as it sounds. She essentially is like an archaeologist, but for ancient sounds, which is a pretty cool gig. But it's also a very dangerous gig, and on a particularly difficult job, something strange happens, and she finds herself trapped, uh, essentially outside of time. And that experience leads to an epiphany, I guess I would say. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I love your characterization of like the eternal present. right? As a way of forcing someone into the eternal present, as a way of resolving something that happened in the past. Yeah, that's fascinating. Stewart, how about you?
Yeah, I don't think I have as well. I grew up on a steady diet of Terry Pratchett and Douglas Adams books, and both of those authors like to play a lot with time and causality and things happening out of order, um, which I think has affected me clearly as an author, since those are things I also enjoy playing with. Um, let's see, what was our question time? Yeah, so some of I guess I'll just talk about a couple of the very short stories in mind that deal with things outside of time. And one of the ones I have in the collection is The Spread of Space and Endless Devastation, which is about basically a sentient ship mind trying to rescue their crew while stuck in a time loop. And eventually, just as Cheryl said with her character in her book, the ship character comes to essentially an epiphany and grows and changes. So that is for sure an interesting thing that I think you can do with time travel and time loops that makes them appealing. That idea of, when we go through life, we only have the one playthrough, I guess. Um, but in fiction, it's interesting to play with that.
Yeah, it definitely is. I can see the Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett influences in the loops and out of orderliness and the playfulness in a lot of your stories, especially referencing time. I'm curious how, because you did mention, Stuart, about having only having this one playthrough and everybody having a strong sense of time always moving forward and so on. But I also find that it's interesting. There are many different philosophies of time. There is a physics of time that we all kind of experience, but there are many philosophies of time that control how we experience the world. One of the things I often think about in my own writing is that storytelling is the process of making meaning out of events that happen in time. And one of the things that can be quite interesting with storytelling is when you change the order of the story, you can actually change the meaning of the story. So I'm curious if maybe you can answer first, Stuart. First of all, do you agree that storytelling is a kind of meaning making? And by altering the way you tell a story, you can actually alter what time means in writing?
Definitely the first part. Yeah, I think storytelling is a lot of how, at least I, as a person, understand and experience realities that might be different from my own. Something I think is especially important as I'm a white person who was born in England and lives in the United States, two nations that are not exactly known for caring deeply about other interpretations of the world than their own. So I've always appreciated being able to read books, even as a child, and get a better understanding of people who aren't me, and as a result, really a better understanding of myself. I'm not sure if we can say that changing our perception of time. I don't know. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Um,
Well,
but I don't have a good answer.
it is an interesting question. Oh, I was just about
I lost
to.
Cheryl again.
Oh, we lost Cheryl. Oops. Okay. Well, hopefully she'll be back. She'll be
Mhm.
back in time. Um, in the meantime, yeah, I guess we can dig into this topic a little bit more because what I'm thinking about is in your stories, especially by reordering the cause and effect,
Hmm.
the order in which things happen, it kind of gives the story itself a different
I see
meaning
what you're saying.
from the way it might have from the meaning what someone might have gotten from it if they had experienced it, sequentially,
Right.
or chronologically. So I'm curious about your thought process in how do you choose to break up time, make up non-linear time to kind of create new meaning in a story.
That makes, yeah. So the way I write is intrinsically out of order, actually.
Oh, okay.
I very rarely start writing the beginning and end up writing the ending. Even for very short stories, I almost always have some kind of outline, even if it's just like bullet points. And I will usually end up writing the ending first. And for me, that's mostly just a way to make sure I don't write interminable dialogue that goes nowhere, which is what I tend to do when left to my own devices. But certainly it means I'm thinking about things that will happen, in the future of the story, even when I'm writing, like the beginning of the story. Um, Trying to find, there's a very recent story by Rachel K. Jones, who's great, which is called like Five Views of the Planet Tartarus or something like
Tartarus. Oh
that.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
I've read that
that's an
one as well.
amazing story. And I think that one's a really interesting one to think about in terms of how, like shifting what you make of the meaning. So this story is about 500 words long, so it's super short. And it starts with this shuttle going to this prison planet, taking prisoners, and all this debris that's around the planet. And the ship goes out of its way to hit as much of the debris as possible. And when you're reading it, you're like, wow, dick move. But then as you go on, you realize that it's not exactly this what it seems on the surface. And by the time you hit that same line at the end, where they try to hit as much debris as possible, it means something totally different.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that story as well. And I personally love non-linear, non-chronological stories. My own novel, Shigidi and the Brassard of Abalafon, is kind of told in a non-linear narrative because I was kind of aiming for more of an emotional meaning as opposed to a straight narrative meaning. So that process always fascinates me. Cheryl, is Cheryl back with us now? Yes, we can see you.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Okay, great.
All right. Welcome back. Just in time to answer the question. And tell us your thoughts on storytelling as a process of making meaning and how you use it in your own stories.
I mean, I definitely agree with that statement. That storytelling is a way of meaning making. I think I tend not to be as experimental in my work, but I do feel that my approach is really to kind of try to figure things out, you know. Typically, I'm trying to figure out something in my own mind. Um, Maybe I have a particular idea or there's an experience that I'm trying to kind of process, make sense of, and stories are how I do that. Um, yeah, they're just how I make sense of the world in general, what I think about things, what I feel about things. And so, in that way, I'm trying to make meaning for myself first, and then trying to make meaning in a wider context. So, yeah, I think that that's really my process. It's sort of that first figuring out, okay, well, what am I actually thinking about whatever this thing is that has come up. And in this particular novella, because it's about grief and pain and quite heavy stuff, uh, it was quite a long process, longer than usual, in terms of just trying to figure out what I wanted to say, what I wanted to express, and needing to get to a certain point, within myself first before I could fully express that on the page. Yeah, so I think in this case it was more intense than usual. Let me say that.
Oh, I remember a point at which you had basically trunked the story. I'm peeling back the curtain a little bit here. Because I was a bit involved with the crafting of the story, and actually more than a little bit, right? Because we're probably going to talk about the Saltyverse next. But I do remember the process, the back and forth, the different versions of the story before we finally landed on this, what I think is basically the perfect version of it. And I'm very glad that you found a way to use the process of telling a story um, to make meaning internally as well as externally, right? Because you made a beautiful story by digging deeper within yourself and finally putting this all out there. So that's awesome. Um, and we should use that as a perfect segue to talk a little bit about the Southverse, which is where your story is set. But before we do that, I should probably let Emily say hello because she's there in the corner. Emily is the publisher of Songs for the Shadow. So do you want to say hi, Emily?
Yes, hi everybody. So I'm Emily. I write and edit as Edie Ebell, and I'm just really excited to hang out with. And I do have this beautiful book which is out today, and I love listening to all this about making meaning about ourselves. It just I there's so many layers in this conversation that I think if you're hearing it, think a little more on some of these topics because there are some brilliant things being said here. So um, and yes, and it's incredibly just our honor to publish this story. It is beautiful. The Southverse is amazing. I love Stewart's stories. I love Stewart's book. Interstellar Flight Press is an amazing press. I also, little secret, Stewart and I co-wrote a novel at one point together that we are still trying to sell. So, if you're out there. So I chuckle when I hear about his process and making meaning and linearity because we learned a lot about our brains co-writing a book. So yeah, it's just really
Awesome.
great to be here.
Yeah, you know firsthand how messy my brain is.
Some people say messy, some people say interesting. Hmm. All right, thank you very much, Emily. And as Emily said, yeah, she loves the Southverse. So you're probably wondering at this point, what is the Southverse? We've mentioned it a few times. Um, I will let Cheryl quickly explain what the Southverse is, how it came to be, and what it's like right now, and how Songs for the Shadows fits into the Southverse.
Okay, this is actually the most important part of the story. So the Southverse is an Afrocentric shared universe created by a group of 10 African writers, and including Wole and myself. And it started 2.5 years ago now. Yeah, a while ago, when Wole reached out looking for anyone who was interested in creating such a world. A few of us got together. We worked with syllable.com, which kind of has a system for collaborative world building processes. And yeah, we had several brainstorming sessions just trying to figure out what kind of universe we wanted to create. And in the end, we worked really well together to develop this sort of speculative fiction universe that includes 5 planets. It's a binary star system. It runs on, or should I say, the primary resource is sound, and because it's based on African principles, African cultures, African languages, we really wanted to make it as authentic as possible, and so it's steeped in oral traditions, and so there's no written language. Everything is based on sound. And that's been a really interesting journey to try to, figure out what would a universe like that look like, what would be different from what we're used to. And, we would find ourselves tripping up every once in a while, forgetting that, oh, wait, we don't have written language. So, okay, a library is not going to be a regular library, and that kind of thing. But also just developing the different systems, the political system, the economic system, figuring out how the different planets relate to each other. Yeah, so many different angles and questions have come up in our discussions, our brainstorming sessions. And since then, we have released the very first anthology of stories set in the Southverse, which came out a year ago. And there it is. It's called Mother Sound, edited by Wole Talabi. And yeah, it's a collection of wonderful stories from the founding members of the collective, but also a few other African writers. And we are now in the process of preparing for the next anthology, which will be called Sauti Terras. So we're really excited about that, and hoping to have more to come. Next one will include more new contributors. So it's growing. At this point, we have, I'm not sure how many, I think over 20 contributors. And with each new anthology, each new project, more people join in. And it's also, because the whole idea was to create a playground that would be accessible and available to, to everyone to play in eventually. And so we're really excited about more people coming in. People are free to send us pitches for stories that they'd like to publish wherever they want to publish them. So essentially the process is you send us a pitch, we take a look at it to make sure that it doesn't contradict anything that exists in the world. And if it does, we kind of make suggestions on how it can be adjusted. And then, yeah, you are free to go off and conquer the world in the name of the Southverse. So it's a really exciting project, and this novella is set in this universe.
Perfect. Thanks, Cheryl. And I think it's important for people to note that, as you can judge, the Southverse is kind of this very flexible universal framework. You don't need to have read all the previous Southie stories to be able to appreciate Songs for the Shadows. All it does, give it this very lush world building that's all in the background that makes it more immersive, more entertaining. I was part of creating the world, but I still fully immersed and loved reading Cheryl's novella as a standalone for what it is. And hopefully, yeah, the Southverse keeps expanding. Cheryl's Songs for the Shadows is the first standalone novella being published in the Southverse. So milestone, well done, awesome. And hopefully there'll be many more. Spoiler alert, I know there will be many more because I know what's coming down the pipeline. Speaking of shared universes, Stuart, one thing I loved about the Butterfly Disjunct was finding these little recurring characters and locations that show up in multiple stories, kind of unexpected, unannounced, but once you've read a few of them, you're like, huh, that location has appeared a few times, right? Like the location in the opening story, Maricourt Crater, kind of shows up, I believe, 4 times across the collection. So it made me wonder, do you have your own larger, internal universe that you've created with these set of characters and locations and settings that you like to return to over and over again, kind of your own Stewart verse, if you will?
So the real secret is I am incredibly lazy, and reusing reusing existing worlds makes writing a lot easier. No, I've read a lot of sort of same universe kind of stories from other authors I admire. Like Ursula K. Le Guin has all her stories set in I always blank on the name of the planets they're from, but you know what I mean. Aliette de Bedard, for example, has the Shuya universe, which is one of my favorite space opera settings. And Eliette has a whole thing on her website of where each story falls in a timeline of it. So stuff like that has always fascinated me as a reader. And I think I've played a few times with setting multiple stories in the same universe. I've been writing short stories mostly since about 2010, so about almost 15 years now. Um, and usually my short stories don't have anything to do with one another. Hainish, that's it, the Hainish cycle for Ursula Le Guin. Thanks, Chris. And then um, so yeah, so I've written a lot of short stories. A lot of them have nothing to do with one another. But a few years ago, maybe 4 years ago, I started to get interested in the idea of trying to write something in a similar universe. And I think that Merrick Crater sort of setting, which is just a specific crater that I found on Mars, and selected for the very scientific reason that it looked nice and round. Um, there's a couple of other stories I've written that are set sort of in that same kind of Mars-ish setting, which really I feel like colonizing Mars type of settings are as much fantasy as they are science fiction in the sense of how believable they are, right? Certainly in the near future. But it's something I've been interested in for a while, that idea. Um, so it was a long way to say sort of. Sometimes I have those shared world stories in mind. Sometimes I don't. I do think it's interesting to be able to return to the same setting multiple times as a reader. Um, so I thought I'd try it out as a writer as well.
No, that's a good point that you made about, several other authors kind of doing that. I always find it interesting when authors return to the same world or to the same characters. It's something I've also done a few times. Actually, I find myself doing it a lot more now. As I've gone on with my writing career, there's like two or three worlds I've returned to over and over again. Um, One of my most recent stories, uh, Encore, is actually a sequel to a previous story. Takes place 3 million years in the future, but I just find it interesting thinking about extrapolating one idea into future stories and layering it. So I thought it was really cool that you did that as well. Um, and don't underestimate the usefulness of having a pre-existing world set up. Actually, one of the things I recall seeing when we were building the Southieverse was a statement that had been made by the creator of one of the first, well-known shared worlds, Robert Asprin, who created or co-created Thieves' World. And one of the reasons they had cited for doing it was that world building was hard. And if they already had the world built, then all the writers just needed to do was, oh yeah, I'll just set my story here. And all of the settings and language and setup and history, all the stuff that makes a world feel lived in was already, kind of predefined.
That's
So yeah,
that's interesting
Liz.
to me, because usually I approach it sort of from the opposite angle. Like I like the world building, but coming up with characters over and over again is hard. So if I can explore different aspects of world building with the same characters, I'm golden.
Well, maybe that's something interesting. Ooh, now I'm thinking about instead of a shared world, but kind of a
Shared
shared
characters.
character. But the characters appear in different worlds, and they're kind of this. You could just explain it away at the end as, oh, they're these interdimensional beings, or
So
they're
George
multiple.
Alec Effinger, who's
Yeah.
an author from the I would say like 60s or 70s mostly. He actually had characters who had the same personality and name, but they did appear in completely different settings that had nothing to do with one another. Interesting
Okay.
stuff.
And did they ever like come up with a retroactive reason why that was? It's just like, oh, they're like time traveling, or they're multi-dimensional
I
beings, or
think
they're
he just
different
said he was
iterations
interested
of the
in
same
like
people.
interested in exploring different iteration kind of thing. It's been a while
Hmm.
since I've read any of his work, but I have a short story collection of his that is essentially all the stories with these same characters in them.
Yeah. I also find that interesting as well. It's something, I guess, something similar that Kim Stanley Robinson did with the Years of Rice and Salt, with essentially the same characters living in different time periods, but the same personality essentially. And I think
Vadra's,
Vajra as
yeah, there you
Chandrasekhar as Rixfall
go.
as well. I
Absolutely.
believe that's something similar. I started reading that, but I'm going to need to take a long break before I finish it. But I can see it's doing the same thing. Um, so yeah, that's interesting. Okay. So let's talk about death. Right. That's always a great sentence you want to hear as an opening for a conversation. Let's talk about death. Um, in both your in both of your books, as I think we've kind of alluded to, um, there are references to death, haunting, or just mortality in a general sense as a key driving force for a lot of the characters. But at the same time, I don't think these are sad books or stories in your case, Stuart, in any way, right? In a way, they kind of affirm and celebrate life. So I found that interesting as using, death, grief, and sorrow almost as an entry point into eventually celebrating life. And I wanted us to discuss that a bit more. And first of all, is that something that you were aware you were doing? Was it conscious? And if so, just why? Yeah. And do you want to go first, Sharon?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, definitely that was a very deliberate thing on my part, mainly because I was tired of being depressed. um, I think I had, you know, I guess there's supposed to be, the different stages of grief and all of that, and I was just kind of fed up of the stages, and I really needed to get to the end of it. And I wanted to write a story that would help me do that, but that would also have a positive message for readers. But then I realized as I was writing it how difficult it is to try to make yourself feel things that you don't actually feel. And so that process itself became such a wonderful experience for me, that I got to a point where I didn't have to fake it. I got to a point where I could actually get to the celebration. And yeah, then it was a lot easier. But it was definitely intentional. It was something that I really wanted to do. I really wanted to tell a story that was about hope and redemption, and how wonderful it is to be a self-aware being, experiencing all of this weirdness and all of the complexity of life. Yeah, so it was something that was always at the back of my mind as I was writing the story, that I really wanted it to be something that would leave people feeling better rather than worse.
I find it fascinating that that's what you wanted, and in the end, you kind of needed to do it for yourself first, before you could actually make it work in the story. It kind of reminds me of something someone said to me once, that if you're really struggling with the story, or if you get very, very stuck, that a lot of the time it's because there's something about ourselves that we don't want to confront, and our mind is leading us there. So consciously, we know where we want the story to go, but internally, we haven't actually done the work to let us get there. So it's like we're fighting ourselves. And that sometimes a lot of the process of unlocking that kind of writing requires introspection and kind of personal development. And when I first heard it, I thought, come on, this is just story writing. Come on, it's never that serious. But having been through it myself a few times, with certain really difficult personal stories, I can kind of get where you're coming from. And I think it works beautifully in the end. I think the finished product, the entire novella really showcases that journey as well. And I just really hope readers appreciate it for what it is. And for those of you on the call listening to this, you've kind of seen a bit of where some of that comes from, right? So yeah, hopefully it all comes across. Stuart, did you want to talk a bit about death?
Sure. I'll always talk about death. Yeah, I think just as Cheryl said, so I suffer from generalized anxiety disorder and also social anxiety, and I have pretty much my entire life from what I can remember. So a lot of the things in my stories that are about, terrible things happening, is sort of my brain's way of working through what if those terrible things happened. Um, in that same sort of way. Um, yeah, like to the point where I want to joke, the real subtitle should be not just and other stories, but and other stories about dead parents, loved ones, and children. Because that seems to be a recurring theme in my short stories, which doesn't sound great until you realize, what I just said about me working through things that I'm anxious about. Um, right. So yeah, and again, going back to that topic earlier of stories as meaning making, right? Like the meaning that I'm trying to make for myself, just as Cheryl said, is to figure things out that are, worrying or stressful or not great, like death.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that. It was years into my writing that someone pointed out almost all of my main characters there are dealing with the death of a parent. And I needed to do a bit of introspection of myself as well. And that was when I realized that I had basically stopped writing. I used to write a lot in my younger years, and I had stopped writing for almost a decade. And I only started writing again, basically the same year both of my parents died. And it kept finding its way into my work, whether I was conscious of it or not. So that was my own process of eventually when people pointed it out. When I now wanted to write new stories and explore that theme, I had to fully reckon with how I actually felt about my parents' death and all of those emotions that had been, bubbling under the surface. And yeah, for me, it's like Cheryl said, almost an epiphany. But I learned something about myself through the process of writing um, the story. So yeah, meaning making, mortality, it's all connected, isn't it? And storytelling can be this powerful experience that we all go through to share what we're thinking with the rest of the world. So thanks. And I know we just talked about death, but I assure you the stories are not depressing themselves. The Songs for the Shadows is the ending. I'm not going to spoil anything for you, but if you've ever been at a traditional, let me say, like a traditional African funeral, where for someone that has died, but that person lived long, was considered a good member of the community, the funeral is not sad, right? And that's very much the feeling that I get at the end of Songs for the Shadows. is the feeling of being at a traditional funeral for someone who has lived well and their life is being celebrated, right? It's that celebration of life. And Stewart's stories are playful. There's almost this joy that comes across, even though we're talking about death and mortality. There's this almost joy at like taking apart the mechanism of the narrative to reveal these unexpected feelings and meanings as you go through the story, as you go through all of the stories. So yeah, these are great books, definitely worth checking out. And speaking of great books, um, I'm going to ask you a general question. What other books do you guys believe that your books are in conversation with, either in terms of style, theme, concept, anything else? And Stuart, do you want to go first? Feel free to give a long list.
A very long list. No. So I've already mentioned Terry Pratchett and Douglas Adams. Definitely when it gets to the playful sort of absurdity that a lot of my work features, they are big influences. Kids Johnson as well, who often plays with things like structure, um, non-traditional storytelling, as it were. Um, I've also been writing a lot of interactive fiction or sort of game writing the last couple of years, and that for sure is a big shift in terms of thinking about writing because with a what the snobby interactive fiction people call static fiction, uh, aka like short stories and novels. And I think it's said with some tongue-in-cheek kind of snobbiness, right? You just have one narrative, whereas in a piece where it changes every time depending on who's playing it and how you play it, that's a big shift because you have to think about not just the single playthrough, as it were, but all the different things that could happen every time like a player or reader interacts with the work. So from that perspective, things like the Final Fantasy series of games, Chrono Trigger, which is an old Japanese role-playing game, also about time travel and how it screws everything up. Um, lots of stuff like that. Um, I could go on, but I'm already
Yeah.
incoherent, so I'll let Cheryl talk.
No, I love that you mentioned interactive fiction and video games. I can definitely see the influence come across. And I love that you chose to mention Final Fantasy and Chrono Trigger because I love those two games. I was an obsessive Final Fantasy fan. I still have not recovered from Sephiroth stabbing Aerith.
Ugh.
I will never recover. It's
And,
trauma
and
I
they
will
made
never
it super
recover from.
weird. I don't know if you've played the remake, but they made it
No,
super
I
weird
have
in
not.
that one because there's like canonically multiple universes. So like even though Aerith is still stabbed and still died, she also doesn't get stabbed and doesn't die. And a lot of people were like, why though? Yeah,
Yeah, no,
I'm
no.
still mad about
I
that too, though, especially in a world where you can literally bring people back to life. Like it's wasteful.
indeed, indeed. Um, but yeah, Cheryl, do you want to mention some books your Songs for the Shadows is in conversation with?
Um, I think, okay, I mean, I feel like it would be cheating to say Mother Sound. um, but
But Mother Sound.
yes, exactly. I think definitely Mother Sound, because mainly because I don't think songs would have happened without Mother Sound. So much of Mother Sound kind of informed um, how that story, turned out. Uh, Also because the short story that I initially wrote that was intended to be in Mother Sound is what kind of led me to write songs because another story that's about the same characters. So yeah, definitely Mother Sound, but also, and this might be a bit weird because it's a work of nonfiction, but this was definitely something that I was reading a lot and thinking about a lot during the writing process. And it's a book called The Wisdom of No Escape by Pema Chodron. So it's a religious book, a Buddhist book, but it talks about pain and grief, and even just the title, The Wisdom of No Escape, was just a recurring theme for me. Going back to that point about the eternal present. So I think it was really more, I was leaning more in that direction rather than fiction. I don't know if that counts. I feel like I'm cheating with that answer, but yeah.
Oh, that's a great answer. And to be honest, I think those are probably the two perfect like, branching connections that you could say are or the two perfect branching links to Songs for the Shadows, right? The Wisdom of No Escape and Mother Sound. It's basically I think it's basically the perfect parents tree, so to speak, to arrive at Songs for the Shadows. So yeah, let's see. I don't know if we have any questions. No questions so far, but someone mentioned not getting the term static fiction. Do you want to clarify what that is, Stuart?
Yes, absolutely. So to clarify that, I should clarify what interactive fiction is. And basically it's like text games. So think of a video game, but based entirely in text form. And usually you interact with these by like typing in commands, like pick up the rock or something like that, or by clicking links like on a web page. So in a piece of interactive fiction, for example, you'll see a bit of story and then you have to do something. So you can think of it like those choose your own adventure books where, you read a section of text, and then you have to decide, do you want to pick up the rock or do you want to pick up the stick? You can tell I'm terrible at thinking up examples off the top of my head, right? But depending on which you do, you might see completely different things. And so in interactive fiction, there's not a single way through a narrative, right? There's multiple ways through a narrative. You can come back to the same part of the narrative over and over and see if it's changed. The ways you interact with like the characters, the settings, the scenery can change the outcome of the story or even the descriptions of the world. And so as a contrast to that, which is like interactive, right, or dynamic because it changes. So some of the people who write interactive fiction will, I I hope jokingly, refer to static fiction as like books or printed stories because they're static in the sense they don't change. So I hope that clarifies that a bit. There's a lot of interesting interactive fiction stuff out there. It's kind of a niche, but an interesting one.
Yeah. I think I've played a few interactive fiction games here and there. They can be fun. They can definitely be fun. And I think you can definitely get a feeling, or the feeling of dynamics even in static fiction. I think that's something you pretty much achieve quite well in the Butterfly Disjunct. Just I think by the sheer number of stories, the playful structure of the stories, the constant, keeping you on your toes feel of the entire collection. I think it produces a similar effect, similar mental effect as you would get from playing interactive fiction, even if you're not the one choosing. But there is that dynamicism in the storytelling itself.
My favorite review of it so far was a 2-star review that was someone saying, I wanted to like this, but it was too confusing and complex. So there you go. That's dynamic right there.
Yeah. I think yeah. Sometimes you can tell a lot about whether you're going to like a book by the negative reviews, right? Yeah. So confusing, complex. Some people might say confusing or complex. Other people say interesting and dynamic. So yeah. Cool. Let's see if there's any more questions, we'll take them. But if not, Emily, did you have any questions for Stewart, to Cheryl, or any points you wanted to bring up?
I was thinking about it, and really the answers have been so great. I think what really was on my mind was I really think for a lot of us this connection of storytelling and basically the topics of this discussion are so are so current, and I think people should actually reflect on what's being said here, that finding meaning in ourselves, offering it as writers to each other or from other writers to us. And even, as a small press, I did not expect to have be publishing right now two books by recently deceased authors in their 20s. If you had told me that at the beginning of 2024, I would have said, "What happened?" One passed away this year while we are working on the book, and the other one was a book that we took on from someone who had been killed. And then I was actually talking to my therapist about this and saying, and this book's also about death. And this book has a lot of death. And but the thing is, I just really liked what you said about it. Well, and what the answer is that they're not. They're about life, and they're about that meaning and finding those joys in a very non-toxic positivity way. And all of you, because Wole's writing is amazing too, all of you have that really that depth in your writing of getting into those layers of meaning and humanity and understanding. And it just, to me, I know this is a comment, but it connects so deeply with these themes and with time, and whether time is linear or the way that different African cultures perceive it less linearly. That I don't know if I'm making sense, but I'm really, my comment is, I think that I would encourage people to actually think about some of these things even more after this is done, because there's so many layers to what everybody here is saying. And I don't know, I just encourage people also, like, pick up the books. I'm here as the publisher, so I can be the promotional person. Definitely pick up everybody's writing here. Wole's writing is amazing. Stewart's is amazing. Cheryl's book, and by the way, I did laugh because you were talking about Songs for the Shadows being intense, and I understand that it very much is. But your song, your story in Mother Sound redefined intense. It's so good. It's so good. But I remember I was like, I had to, like, sit for a moment after reading that story. Everybody should read it. It's so good. So that was just a little rambling for me, but I love this discussion. I really love the topics that you came up with for it. I have enjoyed every bit of it. And yeah, I guess if there's anything else that people are interested in the chat, they can let us know. But thanks for
Yeah.
letting me comment. This has just been a treat to listen to. So
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And we love a good ramble. Sometimes you find the most meaning in a ramble. See, sometimes you find meaning in a
How
ramble.
mysterious.
See, I know it's almost like I'm a writer or something.
well, and honestly though, that is something that, and everyone here knows this, that Athos Arts has been trying to do. I know you're joking, but it's also like joke but not joke. Stewart, people here have grief issues, they have anxiety, deep anxiety disabilities and disorders. And I've been saying a lot, I'm not going to go into this, but that the opposite or the antithesis of oppression is authenticity. And there's so much of not allowing, of telling us to be quiet, to be silenced, to not tell our true stories, to not be embarrassing, to not be too real with who we are. And I guess I would, to people listening, it's really, yeah, the ramble is what I'm telling you, is the neurodivergence. But my point is, yes, sometimes we ramble. It's okay that we're here. It's okay that we're awkward. And these stories are really, really beautiful. And they really get to that authenticity of ourselves and learning about ourselves and learning about each other. So that was a second ramble because you said you liked rambles. So
Yeah, I would buy a bumper sticker that said, "It's okay that we're here. It's okay that we're awkward." You should get on that at the Arts.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you very much, Stewart, Cheryl. I think we are on the hour. So this is probably, we have questions. I was just about to wrap up, and then questions are good. Okay. So question is for Stewart and Cheryl, what are your writing processes? Do you outline, or do you go by the seat of your pants, or some mixed monster of the two? or none at all. So since we're talking about your books, you guys can tell them how you wrote it. What's your process? Cheryl, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, for songs, because it's a Sautiverse story, and we have a kind of a process for the Sautiverse. So there was a pitch, first of all, just a sort of general idea of what I wanted to cover, and the main themes, so we could kind of cross-check whether it would fit in with everything else. And then I wrote a longer outline, and then I kind of went back and forth, changed a few things here and there. Yeah, so it's a bit of both.
Mixed
But
monster.
definitely, yes, mixed monster. But I do like an outline. I like to have an idea of what, where I'm going, and then see what happens.
Perfect. How about you, Stuart? What's your usual process?
I could not nod hard enough to the sentence, I do like an outline. Yeah, I think probably a bit of a mixed monster. I'm trying to find an example of one of my outlines because they're basically just, okay, so here's, oh no, I disappeared. Here's an outline. That's an outline for a short story. It's literally just maybe a one sentence description of each scene. And as I mentioned earlier, like if I don't have an outline, um, I won't get to an ending. I have to have a place I'm ending at, or I stop knowing what I'm doing. So for sure, I'm much more outliney, at least in broad strokes. I don't like the super detailed outlines where you like start with a sentence for the chapter and then you start with a sentence for each paragraph and all that stuff where you like drill down. Those don't work for me, but I can't work without something.
All right. Perfect. And follow-up question from the same viewer. How do you approach getting ideas for fiction? Is it an active thing you pursue or you wait for it and see when it strikes you? Cheryl?
Um, I, I I don't know how to answer that question. I feel like ideas just kind of come. Things happen, life happens, and you hear something, you see something, and then, oh, hey, that could be interesting. So yeah, I don't think I actively pursue them. I think they just come up, and then I'm just inspired, and then I feel the drive to write. Yeah.
Stuart?
Yeah, I agree. Getting ideas is not the hard part for me. And the great thing about writing lots of very tiny stories, as I tend to, is that you can cover a lot of ideas. I think when I was newer to writing, one of the problems I had wasn't so much finding the ideas as turning them into things that made sense as stories. And that can be a lot harder. So I might come up with a concept or like, see something while I'm out walking somewhere and be like, oh, what if X? Um, but what if X is not necessarily a story, even if it's an interesting idea, and that can be hard still, to be honest, to work out.
Yeah, I was just thinking, is there a way of actively pursuing ideas? Ideas just seem to assault me in public. They just come at me unexpected times. Reading something and it's like, oh, idea, idea, idea. I don't know if there's a way to actively pursue them. If there's a place
It's
you
just
can go to get
brainstorming, right?
ideas.
Uh,
Yeah,
you,
I
you
mean,
just write
yeah.
down multiple things until you end up. But again, I feel like it's sort of a shift from idea to execution. Do you think that makes sense to you, Cheryl? And if you have ideas for how to make ideas into good execution, I would love them.
I do not have ideas about that because I also have the problem of too many ideas and not necessarily enough actual stories. yeah, I think that tends to be a common problem in our line of work.
Yeah, too many ideas, not enough time, or, just getting stuff done. All right. I think that's probably a good last question. I will remind everyone again, the books are The Butterfly Disjunct and Other Stories, which is a great collection, and Songs for the Shadows, which is a Saltiverse story by Cheryl Ntumy, and it's a novella, so nice and short and immersive and easy to read. Go get them. They just came out, I believe, within the last few weeks. Don't have the exact dates, but they're very recent, so hot off the presses, for those that like to get fresh new books like bread, freshly baked. Thank you for joining us for this discussion on mystery and meaning and mortality. I think we can wrap up here. It's been a lot of fun talking with you guys. I don't know if we lost Stewart, hopefully not. But anyway, even if we did, it's a perfect time to say goodbye. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the stories.
Thank you, Wale. Thanks, Emily. Thank you, Stuart. And thanks, everyone, for coming.